Hello friends, welcome back to another Magic Monday. Today we're looking at a deck called Fear the Fae with Obyra, Dreaming Duelist. 2 mana for an uncommon fairy warrior, 2/2 flash flying. Whenever another fairy you control enters, each opponent loses 1 life. Real simple commander, cheap to get out. You can already see where we're going here. It's a fairy tribal. I will tell you there are probably better commanders. Actually, I'll guarantee you there are better commanders for a fairy tribal deck, but I like to use uncommon commanders when possible. 31 creatures, 28 non-creatures, average mana cost of 3, pretty even split between blue and black. Of those 31 creatures, 23 are fairy. There are 4 shapeshifters as well, and a couple of constructs and, mostly fairies. 3 instants, 5 sorceries, 11 artifacts, 14 enchantments, including a fairy enchantment. More on that in a second. So what do we got? We got a whole bunch of mana rocks, because of course we do. We got Mox Amber, we've got Arcane Signet, we've got Mindstone, blah, blah, blah. Boring. We got fairies. We got Sleep Cursed Fairy. It's 1 blue for a 3/3 flying ward 2 rare. And it enters tapped with 3 stun counters on it, or you can untap it for 2. It's a cheap fairy to get out to trigger the commander. Ego Drain for some discard. Fairy Dream Thief because it's a cheap fairy. Emrakul's Messenger. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn token with sacrifice this creature, add colorless. That's fun. And really cool art on that messenger. Fairy Mastermind lets us draw cards when our opponent draws their second card in a turn, and we can force draw cards. I've always wondered who the art is of this fairy mastermind, because it looks like it's very much modeled off of a person. I don't know if that's a friend, a developer. Maybe it's the artist Joshua Raphael himself. I have no idea. Fairy Vandal. We get 1/1 counters when we draw cards. Night Veil Sprite lets us surveil. This guy lets us have a 1/3 Vigilant Flyer or mill 4 cards and put an instant sorcery or fairy from among them into your hand. Counterspell here, which has this special plus an additional 1 for each fairy you control. Blood Artist, because fairies can be a little squishy. We got a fairy here. Bitter Blossom is our enchantment fairy, so this will trigger Obyra. And each turn, we lose a life and trigger Obyra again. So it's a little self-destructive because of the losing a life, but it's so good. It's so good in this deck. Raise the Draugr, because we could return 2 target creature cards that share a creature type to our hand. We've got this Trespasser's Curse, just to have a little bit of life gain to offset things like Bitter Blossom. We put in Vran because it's a powerful card. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control die, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life once per turn. It doesn't fit with fairy, but it fits with a lot of other things, like how my creatures die, because they're squishy fairies. Likeness Looter lets us copy a creature card in our graveyard. Sneaky Snacker comes back to the graveyard, or from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped if you draw 3 cards in a turn. Probably not going to happen, but it's a fairly cheap fairy, and it triggers Obyra. We got an animating fairy, just a fairy, honestly. And I mean, we could do the sorcery thing, but whatever. Brazen Borrower. We got Mocking Sprite here, which reduces the cost of instant sorceries, of which we have very few. Another fairy here. Another fairy here. Another fairy here. You get the point. There's a lot of fairies. Chancellor of Tales, that's a fairy. Storyteller Pixie? Jeez, I can't talk. Storyteller Pixie. Another fairy there. Fairy here. Spellscorn Coven. Whatever. This would probably be a better choice for a commander because, of that ability. Whenever an opponent casts a spell with mana value, power, or toughness equal to the chosen number, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. That's pretty cool. You just pick their commander. But again, uncommon. Uncommon commanders are cool. Roaming Throne, choose fairy. Every fairy that enters battlefield triggers twice. So when you play a fairy, Obyra triggers twice. Every time. Amazing. Fairy Formation lets us create fairy tokens, draw cards, and in and of itself is a fairy. Into the Fey Court creates a fairy and lets us draw 3 cards. High Fey Negotiator is another fairy. We got a Fairy Slumber Party. Return all creatures to their owner's hands, which unfortunately counts our commander. But we get to create some fairies as well. And Fairy Fencing, which doesn't actually do much fairy specific other than it gets an additional -3/3 until end of turn if you control a fairy as you cast the spell. So for a single black, we can give something -3/3, or we could do additional if it's a tougher creature. And finally, Stolen by the Fae. Return target creature with mana value X to its owner hand. You create X 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens with flying. Amazing with Obyra out, particularly if you also have the walking golem guy, the roaming throne, this thing. So if you have those 2 things out, you're making a lot of damage happen, and you're bouncing something back to the opponent's hand. We have our normal array of lands. We put in Dranith Ruins as well, because if we have a lot of mana, most fairies are fairly inexpensive, and we could put an additional 2 1/1 counters on a fairy that entered the battlefield this turn. But let's go back a little bit. Because it is a tribal deck, we have cards like Metallic Mimic, as per the usual. And we've got Adaptive Automaton here. We've got Coalition Construct here. All 3 of those will give +1/1 to fairies. Icon of Ancestry gives 1/1 to fairies. Urza's Incubator reduces fairy cost by 2. We also put in a Vanquisher's Banner, so they get +1/1 and I'm drawing cards, which can trigger some of those other things. So there's the tribal section. Cruel Reality is in here because it's just a super powerful aura curse and I love it. At the beginning of enchanted player's upkeep, they sacrifice a creature or planeswalker or lose 5 life if they can't. And we've got some control stuff like Crippling Fear. You choose fairy. Everything that's not a fairy gets -3/3 until end of turn. Great board wipe, potentially. Surgical Metamorph lets us copy any permanent on the battlefield, whether we own it or not. Revenge of Ravens, just to reduce some of the damage we take if our opponent is attacking us. So that helps a little bit because, I mean, fairies aren't that strong, even with all these buffs and things. Tainted Remedy, if an opponent would gain life, they lose that much life instead. Put Stab Wound in here because it's a -2/2 to an enchanted creature, and the owner of that creature loses 2 life every turn. Phyrexian Arena for some extra card draw. Bastion of Remembrance for some extra life gain and damage as creatures we control die. Put in Rhystic Study as well for some card draw. Imprisoned in the Moon, which is super fun to play on somebody's commander. It's a big giant middle finger, and it's a common. And Deep Freeze as well also works well on commanders. But that's pretty much the whole deck. It's, again, not as powerful as it could be. You could put in a different commander and have better results. But I wanted an uncommon commander, and I really like the each opponent loses 1 life, especially when it triggers more than once. Now, there are other things we could have put in here. So, like if we made this an additional color, we could put in an Elish Norn so that it triggers an additional time. Like there's different things you could do with this, but I really wanted to stick with the fairy tribal thing, which is why if we go back here, we have 2 wizards, both of which I believe are fairies. We have 2 vampires, right? We have 2 Phyrexians. Even the Eldrazi is a fairy. So it really covers the fairy pretty strongly, the fairy theme pretty strongly. So anyway, that's the deck, Fear the Fae. Before we get to the games, let me just remind you to always be kind to yourselves, to be kind to each other. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.